With the conclusion of round 7, we are now officially closer to Origin than we are to the start of the season. So we're going to see a lot of splitting off in the next few weeks between head-to-head and overall teams because the strategies are going to be vastly different. Guys who we'll be targeting as overall players are going to be playing those round 13, round 16, round 19 Origin weeks. And for head-to-head, ideally you're going to look for guys who actually have buys there so that they actually use up their buy while you're having a week off during the Origin weeks. So for head-to-head, guys like Grant, you can pretty much just have Grant and maybe one or two backups. Grant on his own is going to do you no harm because he's going to be available all of those other weeks. But for everybody else in the overall camp, it's going to come down to a lot more strategy and planning. So let's get stuck into the hooker position in particular, with Jaden Brayley going down and Robson and Grant with a couple of low scores this week. I have the schedule up here. You can see 7 teams have a bye each major week, each Origin week, and in the week that they back up, 3 teams have the bye instead of the 1 each week. That, I think, is actually going to be harder than the Origin weeks because you have to play a full 17 in those minor bye weeks compared to only your starting 13 for 13, 16, and 19. If you're thinking how hard it is now with one team on a bye and a couple of injuries and suspensions being able to field 17 each week, imagine how hard it's going to be for those minor bye rounds, which is why we need to start planning now, or you're going to lose out on a fair chunk of points throughout this mid-season. Okay, so what we've got to look at is we've got to go through these 17 teams and find hookers who are actually going to be reasonably relevant. And I've reasonably summarized up here. We've potentially got a few others, say Brendan Hand's got his first full game this week. Maybe he pushes out Hodgson out of the starting role by Origin, but we can't prove that. We can't rely on that. So I, for now, have these about 10 teams or so which have relevant players. We've got our Storm with our Grant and Cowboys with our Robson as probably our 2 main gun hookers that we'll be looking at to go through this Origin period, whether you want to hold Grant, whether you don't have him at all and are just going to run with Robson, or even if you're a little bit pod with Cook. The strategy is pretty similar for Cook and Grant, so just apply all these Grant strategies I'm about to talk with next to Cook as well. So most of us probably have Grant, and there's a lot of variation how we can go about it with Grant, so I'm going to go through him first. One big thing that I actually didn't realize until I went over and looked at this again is that Crossland doesn't get his duel until after round 13. So he won't get the hooker duel, even if he keeps that spot, until after round 13. So you can't use him as Grant cover on his own for round 13. You can see the dual position updates. We've got a couple at the end of round 1, round 6, and then round 13 and 20. So in all reasonableness, you can't rely on him unless you're just looking at him as pure half cover, and then potentially is only round 16 cover. So this Grant misses all 3 Origin weeks, and most of the other hookers will play 2 of these weeks, and there's always going to be one that misses, and you've got to have a backup plan for that. So these couple, you've got to have a backup plan for round 19. Robson plays round 13 and 16, which is great. And he's great to have in the beginning period of Origin, as you can see, because he'll be a gun, and you won't need to touch your team for a fair while, and you can potentially just leave it at that. Honestly, Grant and Robson is probably one of the better strategies going through this period, with Robson and Grant both being top tier guns, and when Grant's missing on those buys, Robson providing you an easy 50 plus score most weeks. 33 this week's probably a low one, and he'll go back to normal shortly, but things can happen. So you do need cover for that round 19 bye. At the moment, I'm most interested in Jake Simpkin if Api Coruscant makes it back into Origin. I'm not liking the chances that Coruscant will. I think Nico Hines is going to have to be in the team somewhere, and he might be on the bench, and it'll be tough to run a bench utility and a bench hooker. But there is a chance, and if Simpkin is there, he's probably around 14 buy for cash, and then even if you do have Robson, because you're scoring your starting 13, you will waste Simpkin's score, but he'll be fine as cash generation in the meantime. Round 19, he'll be available, and you can probably sell him shortly after that when he's peaked. If you don't have Simpkin, probably Paul Mamazelos is going to be your round 19 guy. Just probably your first real red dot that you want to bring into your team as you sort of head towards your final gun 17 at the end of this origin period. So the second strategy is to go with guys who missed the round 16 bye, and that's mainly Jeremy Marshall-King. He is actually quite a special little hooker because both him and Wade Egan are from the only two teams that miss 1 out of 8 games during this origin period. If you go back and look, the Dolphins and the Warriors only miss round 16, whereas every other team misses at least 2 through that period. So guys like Sean Johnson, Tohu Harris, and Lemuelu potentially, Jeremy Marshall-King, all going to be very, very valuable for your squad if you have them through that period. As long as they don't play Origin, Hammer's a chance, but there's also a good chance that Hammer could be an absolutely fantastic centre to have through this period as cover. If you have him, great job. If you don't have him, I'd probably wait until Origin to jump on now, given his price, if he doesn't end up playing. But as we can see, Jeremy Marshall-King covers every single round that we need him to, apart from round 16. And the good news is there's plenty of hookers that can cover as backup. Sonny Luke, if he's around and relevant by then. Brandon Smith, the cheese, he'll be good. Reed Marnie even, and Jake Simpkin, like I was saying before. The thing with Reed Marnie is I'm not particularly enthused with all the negatives he seems to be putting up. He's still putting up like about a 50 average, but he'll go from a 30 to a 65, and you really don't know what you're going to get. And you probably want as many guaranteed points as you can for these single slot hooker rounds when you can only play your starting 13. That doesn't mean you get your best 13. That means you only get the ones on the park. So your 1 hooker, your 3 mids, your 2 edges, your 2 halves, etc. So I like that guaranteed score more than a potential upside with a bit more variation in that week. So I really like the fact that Cheese has the mid duel as well. I really like Cheese as a buy in general because you can use him as that mid cover. I think round 16 is going to be very tough for mids because if we look at it, we can see that some of the teams on the round 16 bye are the Raiders and the Warriors, as we were talking about, and the Dolphins. But that really means that along with your Origin guys that you might be holding, like Payne Haas is one you can probably get away with holding. Not great, but you can get away with it compared to someone like Murray. But that also means there's going to be no Tarpanay, no Ford, no Tohu Harris, as well as anybody else. That's why I really like guys like McInnes and Cheese as a mid cover going forward, because you can use Cheese with the duel as one of those tough slots to fill in round 16. Okay, so we can see that probably you can use a multi-hooker strategy with probably Sonny Luke and Cheese and Grant, with Cheese kind of as just a scorer in your 17 in the other weeks and a mid for round 16. Jake Simpkin is probably the ideal one if he's there, but there's not a 100% chance of that, so we'll just wait on that. And now the one that is probably the least likely to happen is, and probably my least favorite strategy, is using Reed Marnie because he plays round 16 and round 19, and you just have to cover for that round 13 bye. Now, Crossland doesn't fix this anymore, I've realized, so he actually doesn't really work in this strategy. You'd have to go for somebody like Paul Marmazelos and then potentially even hold him all the way through to round 19 for that round 19 bye. But if you have Reed Money, you probably don't, but I think you can just do a little bit better elsewhere. I think you can just have a round 13 hooker. It's much easier to plan in advance for the first week than it is for the future weeks like round 16 and round 19. That's just another knock I have on buying Marnie strategy-wise. So in summary, my favourite strategy is probably the Grant Robson strategy. Robson just covers so many of those weeks in general. Cowboys are one of the only teams to play all those 3 minor bye rounds, so that's going to be very valuable for you, especially if Grant doesn't back up any of them. And just, it's really helpful in general with making a 17 in those weeks. And if Simpkin's available, that's my favourite strategy. Robson, Simpkin, and Grant. Simpkin for that round 19. And if it goes wrong and there's no Simpkin, well, you can have Marmozelos as your round 19 guy. Just as probably your first red dot. You can probably hold him for the rest of the year then, as you've probably got at least 14, 15 guns by then, hopefully. And you don't really need everybody. It's not great to have too many red dots this year, though, at the back end of the year, because the buy players will kind of act as the loopers anyway. This strategy is compatible with cheese in the mids, as it is with most strategies. So I quite like that as well. My second favorite one is buying Jeremy Marshall-King in round 14. Now, that's a big difference to buying him now. And why would I suggest buying him in round 14? Well, it's only good if you don't have a hooker playing in round 13 and you have Jeremy Marshall-King for round 13, because otherwise you will start to double up. If you have Robson and Jeremy Marshall-King, I do not recommend buying Jeremy Marshall-King beforehand, because you will completely waste one of their two scores, probably missing out on 50 points. I like Jeremy Marshall-King probably for this strategy. I'm not sure why I put it by round 14 for this. Grant, Robson, Jeremy Marshall-King, it would be that. But that's 3 gun hookers. That's a lot of cash, so probably not. So buy Jeremy Marshall-King for round 13 if you're going for this strategy. So I'll just fix that up now, actually. But yes. So Cheese works again in the mids. He'll be great. This is my next favorite strategy. Simpkin would be absolutely great to have through this period as pretty much your main hooker cover. He covers around 16 and 19, which should fix your problem. It's not a gun score, but it's very good for cash generation potentially. The Tigers have the worst buy schedule in the comp for Origin stars, so Coruscant misses guaranteed 2 more games than the non-Origin players, and has 2 two-day turnarounds, which means Simpkin, if he's there, gets at least 4 games in the starting hooker, and he's going to be around base price. So in all seriousness, Simpkin is looking like the best cash cow of this whole Origin period if he actually gets that starting role with Coruscant away. Marmozelos again works, but yeah, you have to sell him, I think. I don't think you can hold him through that period. And then after that, you can go cheap using Sonny Luke instead. It's not as good as Simpkin because you will need a round 19 guy in Marmozelos and a round 13 guy. Then you will probably have to hold him, and I'm not sure if I like that as much. Another strategy is to use Crossland as a cash cow half cover. He doesn't work with covering Grant's hooker, so you will need like a Marmozelos or a Jeremy Marshall-King along with that strategy, which is why I've got it all the way down here. He's not really a good hooker strategy as you might call it. He does cover around 16, but I really prefer using him in the halves because no Sean Johnson, no Cleary, and Adam Dewey's no longer in the picture. I think he'll probably be more useful as a half in round 16 anyway. Moving on to the Robson strategies. If you don't have Grant, you probably have Robson. So Robson covers nearly all the rounds. Round 15 bye, that's the only team on the bye that week, the Cowboys. So if you have any other hooker in your team at all from any other team, it will cover that. What we need to worry about is the round 19 bye. Crossland, his duel is useful, but he's not really that compatible with Robson. Misses the round 19 bye as well, and you can only use him as a half in those other 2 Origin weeks. Cheese is compatible with him as a mid, as he is with most, but again, he doesn't fix the round 19 problem. So the solutions for that are Robson and Jake Simpkin if he's there. This, I think, is the best and most simple out of every strategy there is. This is the only strategy that can potentially get you a score every week for the amount of money you can spend on it. Robson in round 13 and 16 is going to score for you, and Simpkin in round 19. You will waste Simpkin in round 16, but he's probably not going to be like a 50 plus score. He might score you a 40, and he's not a gun like Robson, so it won't matter as much, and he's going to be generating cash, so you're not losing out anyway. My second favorite strategy is to use the Robson Sonny Luke cheese strategy. You can probably use cheese only to avoid wasting Sonny Luke's points and have cheese as mid cover. As hooker cover here instead of mid cover. But again, I do like cheese's availability in the middles for that tough round 16 middles. So you can potentially do either of them, and then round 19 you go for Marmazelos if Jake Simpkin isn't available with that first strategy. Third one, I don't like it as much. Yeah, this is the one that I was saying you should buy in round 14 because you would waste probably 50 points with Jeremy Marshall-King and Robson both in round 15. He's not a cash cow. You're paying a decent chunk for him. He might make a little bit of money, but the thing is, you're not buying him for that. You're buying him for cover and points. He's only going to give you that round 19 cover because both Robson and Jeremy Marshall-King play round 13, and you're only going to get one of them, so it's a waste. Buy him in round 14 if you have Robson and you kind of don't like the look of the others so much, or you have to sell Cheese or Sonny Luke earlier. Cheese works as well, but only with mid because Robson covers round 16, so that's the way you go about that. I actually quite like Robson and Jeremy Marshall-King strategy. I think it's just going to depend on how expensive Marshall-King is by that time because he is slowly creeping up, and I think there's every chance that he could be sort of almost mid 700s. I think he could creep up into like the 27-30k bracket by then, and it makes just a little bit expensive for somebody that isn't going to be like a top shelf gun. He's probably going to be like maybe the fourth or fifth best behind Robson, Cook, and Grant this year. And finally, if you don't have any guns at all, if you've gone cheap and you're running with Tanner Boyd or something as your hooker at the moment, I do recommend getting Jeremy Marshall-King as that good scorer through the origin period. You'll then only need to cover round 16, and Crossland can do that because you'll most likely have dual by then. You can do it with Cheese as well, but I like his mid, as I've said. And you can just do it with just him and Cheese if you like. Tanner Boyd, I haven't put on this list for one reason, and that's because he misses both round 13 and 16. He's dreadful cover early on. He could be very useful for round 19, but as sort of a mid to high 40 scorer in semi-ideal circumstances, I really don't know whether we're going to have him for that long. He could be well gone by then. He's probably going to hurt your team unless he's scoring quite well to hold him that long. I think it's going to hurt to hold him that long unless he's going to make you quite a lot more money from where he is at the moment. I'm very happy with him covering Grant's round 9 bye, but I don't know whether I'm going to hold on to him post round 12 when he has his bye in round 13. I might move him on. I might move him on to Jeremy Marshall-King if I don't have Robson at that stage, or I might buy Robson instead and just leave Boyd out of it until later and go for a Marmazelos or Simpkin. I think I like Simpkin better than Boyd, but we don't know whether that's going to happen at this stage. So a couple of things just to finish off and just to remember, as I've been saying, Origin players will miss those 3 weeks. You want players that ideally play the week after, just in case they don't back up. It is going to be really, really tough to field a full 17 in those weeks with Origin players potentially not backing up and potentially 3 teams instead of 1 team on the bye. You're going to have to plan for that really well. I think round 14 is going to be the nasty one because the Knights are pretty popular, the Eels are pretty popular. Honestly, I think Hopgood being a sell and Carty being a sell helps us more than it hinders us because it allows us to buy 1 or 2 more others. It allows us to get Crossland without worrying as much. It potentially allows us to hold on to Miller to get a Will Penasini or something like that. But yeah, it's going to be tough. I don't think you can have 4. I don't think you can have 4 without really, really risking playing with 15 or 16 maximum in round 14, because the guys you probably want to hold are these guys that have the longer turnarounds and do have 2 buys so that they don't miss really anything. For your overall squad, they had to buy anyway, even though they're on Origin. That's why Grant was so good. I'll just go back to that quickly. Yeah, you can see that the best teams are the Panthers, Roosters, and Titans for this. The Storm and the Broncos are okay, particularly the Storm, and I say that because Grant is probably going to have a 40-40 minute hooker split with him and Ben Hunt. Queensland seem to like doing that for the Maroons these days, so I think he'll definitely back up and play at least most of the game, especially on those 4-day turnarounds, that 4-day turnaround in round 14, so I think will be right. But yeah, the Panthers, Roosters, Titans, they're good players to target for post round 13, and potentially for guys who will back up. So Teddy probably backs up. Cleary probably backs up. Payne Haas maybe backs up, probably reduced minutes. And yeah, Titans don't have as many relevant players, but if you're somebody that has Tino, don't worry too much because it's actually a pretty good buy schedule for him. Okay, so we're pretty much coming to the end of the hooker video. I'll go through the middles next. They're probably going to be the next most important point of contention because we're going to have a really tough round 16, as I keep mentioning, for the middles. I'm going to go through most of the positions a little bit quicker and look at potentially some of these good, bad cover and when to target certain teams because they have an early bye or because they have 2 origin weeks for the origin stars or potentially because they have 2 weeks for the club members. Yeah, I will say early on, some of the best are the Eels and the Cowboys because the Cowboys play all 3 minor bye weeks. And the Eels are the only team out of all 17 to play all 3 origin weeks. So I love guys like Ryan Madison if he doesn't make origin. Will Penasini potentially if you're prepared to jump on at that expensive price now. I would have really loved to have Hopgood. He would have been amazing to have through this as a mid-edge duel and a keeper that plays all 3 origin weeks. He probably was going to fix that round 16 mess, but he's just not going to get the minutes, I think. Last week, he got quite a few minutes on the weekend, but he's just missing so many tackles that I don't think you can count him as the same bracket as some of those other top shelf guys, and he's going to lose a little bit more money this week. And unless he keeps those minutes probably above 60, I don't think you can hang on to him that long. If you want to, he will probably be very useful for you, but prepare to cop that cash loss in order to have that extra points and extra cover. All right, guys, middles next week, giving you a bit of a taste for that. Now, just make sure that you plan and have a look at when your teams play and when your teams are on the bye to make sure that you're going to have a full 13 for round 13 and a full 17 for round 14 or as close as you possibly can. There's going to be a lot of strategy in changing up your team and preparing for round 16. I've shown you how to do that for the hookers a little bit, but we'll go through some of the others in the next few weeks. Have a good one.